So I just spent $2,000 on a LUMIX S5II as my first full frame camera. Was this a good purchase or something I'm gonna regret? Hopefully we'll find out today, because in this video, I'm gonna give you my thoughts on this camera after the first few weeks of using it. Spoiler alert, I kinda like it. The reason I was drawn to LUMIX in the first place was because I come from a LUMIX background with an entry-level LUMIX G85. This is a camera I've been using for 3 years, had great success with it, and I've come to be very familiar with how it operates, and so I wanted something that had a familiar feel with the menus and some of the controls. And my first impression pulling it out of the box was, this feels like the big brother of my old LUMIX, just in how the buttons were laid out, and like the focus control switch is in the same spot on both cameras, and the texture of the camera and the grip and everything feels just like home. It just feels good in my hands. Like, I have big hands, and so a nice, good, solid block of a camera just feels good. Like, it just fills up my hand and it feels right. Comparing these two cameras side by side, they definitely look pretty similar. And to the untrained eye, you might think, well, what's the big difference? What makes this camera $2,000 instead of $600 or $700 for the G85? There are a ton of features you're getting for $2,000 that just aren't there in entry-level cameras. The G85 shoots in 4K, but only up to 30 frames per second, whereas S5II can go up to 60 frames per second for slow motion. Also, the bitrate is about double, so you can get up to 200 megabits per second in the S5II versus 100 in the G85. That just means you have more detail and bigger file sizes. The S5II can also shoot in 6K. But some less obvious things are like the dynamic range and the low light performance that are much better in a more expensive camera. Specifically, this one is a full frame camera compared to a crop censored micro four thirds camera like I had before, and so the low light performance is going to be much better. And this was the main reason I decided to move away from the micro four thirds lineup, because I could have gotten a professional level micro four thirds camera, and went ahead and got a full frame camera, because this summer I'm going to be doing some video shoots that require filming kind of by firelight, and so having some good low light performance was something I prioritized. So I pulled the camera out of the box, got it charged up, tested out to see if it would work on my DJI RS3 Mini. More on that later. And then I headed outside to get my first footage. It's a little chilly out here. We're bundled up today. I mean, wearing a jacket. So I'm figuring out what things mean, but right now I have it on continuous autofocus, which we're just gonna see how that works. This is a very new thing for me, using autofocus, because my LUMIX G85 did not have good autofocus at all. It was LUMIX's standard contrast-based autofocus that is well documented as being pretty annoying and not very good for video. My solution for that was to pretty much run manual focus all the time. But this camera has a good autofocus system, so they tell me, and so I'm gonna see how it works, see if I trust it, check it out. I might end up using manual focus still sometimes, but I'm gonna at least try this phase detect autofocus system. But real quick, let's get some better audio. I'm gonna grab this Rode Video Micro, throw it on top here, and see what it sounds like. So right now you're listening to the internal microphones on the S5II. And this is the audio with an external shotgun mic mounted on top of the camera. No, this is not a super fancy mic, and no, I'm not an audio engineer. I could be clipping, I don't know at this point. I see my meters on the screen. Anyway, before I go any further, I'm gonna go ahead and dial in some settings that I know I want, like having some exposure control meters on the screen. So I'm gonna jump in here, turn on the histogram, maybe some other things. I think I know some terms, maybe I don't. Anyway, I'm gonna turn on some stuff and see if it helps me. So initially, one thing I really like in the first 5 minutes of using this camera is that the screen is not impeded by the mic jack. The screen is basically identical to the screen that was on my other camera, so no real upgrades there. But what we can do on the screen is a little bit of an upgrade. So let's see, much more advanced menu system here than I'm used to, but the same kind of format, which I like. Microphone, I want to set the recording levels down. Let's try -5. We're not peaking, I don't think, so that's good. Photo grid line. Rule of thirds, I like that. Man, so many things. Anamorphic D-squeeze. I can't even begin to know how to use some of these settings, if I'm being honest. Fan mode, I'm gonna say auto. Like I said, 35 degrees out here, just polar Arctic temperatures right now, so that fan's not gonna be running. Right now, we're in a very busy background environment that contrast-based autofocus on my old camera would really struggle with. So, how are we doing here, LUMIX? How are we doing? Are you keeping my face in focus? If I look around, if I turn away and come back, you still know I'm here. I'm really excited to see how this works, because this would be a total game changer in how I make videos if autofocus can be depended on. So I went inside for a second to get my hands warmed up, because it is a frigid 35 degrees out here. Ooh, cold. It's not cold out here.
but I'm just kind of wimpy about the whole thing. So we have dual card slots on this camera. That's a new thing, pretty cool. In case you couldn't tell, I'm pretty well a beginner at this whole pro level video camera situation. There's a lot to learn, but I am game because cameras are super cool. But as it stands right now, my plan with the dual card slots is to do redundant recording. This camera does 4K 60, as you can see here, for some nice slow motion, 50% speed or 40% speed, depending on if you're working in 30 frames a second or 24. It is cropped in though. I'll show you an example here. Full frame versus the APS-C cropped 4K 60. This is, yeah, I mean, it's a bummer. It'd be nice if you had full frame 4K 60, but it's kind of a common thing actually. I mean, the Sony a7 IV in the same price range within $500 or so of the S5 II, it also has an APS-C crop on 4K 60. I think the Canon R5, which is the same price range also, does have full frame 4K 60, which is nice. But you know, you're talking $500 to $700 more for that feature is like the only reason I would really go with the R5 instead of the S5 II. So I don't think I'm really gonna notice it. To film anything at a higher frame rate than 60 frames per second on this camera, you do have to drop down to 1080p. Let's check out and see how that looks. I'm gonna jump into the slow and quick mode, S&Q mode on the dial, and see what 1080p 120 frames per second looks like. We're just gonna have to find something out here that's moving enough to get an idea of what some slow motion action looks like. See what we can find. I mean, chickens aren't exactly action stars, but at least we got maybe a good example there of some slow motion. Yes, 4K 120 would be awesome. And you kind of wonder why some of these big cameras don't have it, because, I mean, this can do 4K 120. And I mean, this is just a little tiny action camera. Why can't we get that in some of these big cameras like the a7 IV, LUMIX S5 II? I'm not quite sure. I mean, even if it was not the highest bitrate, like even if it was just action camera level 4K 120, at least you have it and you don't have to go down to 1080p. Anyway, they don't, so that's a bummer. But to get 4K 120, you're really looking at, you know, $3,500 worth of camera to get to that level in a hybrid camera. So I can't really be mad that this doesn't have it. So I'm a video-centric creator. I make videos. I mean, I like the ability, I want the ability to take pictures, but I'm not a photographer. I'm a videographer, amateur filmmaker, all those things. So video features are number one to me, and Lumix has chosen to really prioritize video features with their S series cameras. So there's features in the S5 II that really level it up as a filmmaking camera, and features that the Sony a7 IV, Canon R5 don't have. Now, I'm not at a stage in my filmmaking career to really appreciate all those things, like a full-size HDMI output, real-time LUT, open gate 6K stuff that I just learned about in the last few months, but I'm sure they will come in handy down the line. And it's cheaper than the Canon and Sony competitors, so it was kind of a no-brainer for me to go with the S5 II. The original S5 did not have the phase detect autofocus, and after my experience with my G85 with contrast-based autofocus, I don't think I would buy another contrast focus camera again. At least not at this point when I really only have the budget for one main camera. But I really like the Lumix line, and seeing that they have one now that has phase detect autofocus instead, I was like, sign me up. I mean, it took me a while to get to that point. I kind of hemmed and hawed about it for a few months. It's $2,000 to spend. I wasn't asking for the dotted line, just like super quick, but. So I got a kit from B&H Photo that has a 50mm lens, the 50mm 1.8 prime, along with the camera obviously, and a 20 to 60 3.5 to 5.6 variable aperture zoom lens. And that's what I have on right now, is the 20 to 60. All right, so we've checked this camera out enough with a handheld situation. Maybe we can see where the stabilization does well, where it kind of falls short a little bit. Corners wobbling around a little bit. Let's go ahead and head inside, rig this camera up on my RS3 Mini, make sure the gimbal works well with it, and also give my poor fingers a chance to warm up because they are freezing off. Alright, so we had to lose the shotgun mic just so we didn't have to redo the balancing job I did on a gimbal earlier. It took me like 15 minutes to balance. I'm just not experienced with it yet. I think I'll get faster. But yeah, so clearly working well. I'm just vlogging with the gimbal, which I mean, I don't really need to do. The camera's steady enough without it. But yeah, I mean, it's great to have good stable footage even for vlogging. Let's try to get some creative B-roll shots. I don't know, see if we can test it out a little bit and push it to the limit a little bit. But honestly, I think this camera is really a perfect match for this gimbal. I feel like it's not really strained at all. So anyway, let's test it out a little bit. Let's go ahead and get some test walks here. I'm just gonna walk along here. I'm really not trying to be smooth at all right now. I'm just walking and we can see what the footage looks like. Now right now I'm gonna try to really smooth it out get as smooth as I can. All right, I've got a good subject here now, the cat over there. I'm gonna try zooming out the lens because I need longer focal length to capture her. So we're all the way zoomed out, obviously no longer in balance, but let's see if it can handle it. All right, no warning on the screen, that's good. Wow, terrific. I did want to test out some of the other picture profiles. Okay, one other picture profile, log. So let's see what it's all about. What's the big deal with Vlog? Obviously very desaturated, but let's do a quick color correction. Here we are. How do we look? So if you're one of the people watching this and don't have a clue what I'm talking about with some of these things, picture profiles, Vlog, you know, aperture, shutter speed, any of these terms, drop a comment. I love to know who's watching these videos, what your experience level is, what your knowledge level is. Some of you are probably more experienced than me, some probably less, and I'd be really happy to share the knowledge that I have and make some more videos. So comment below your thoughts. So log format is a certain way of capturing an image and capturing the colors and then the information so that it's very desaturated, but you're able to bring back that saturation and contrast in post. And this means you can capture more range of highlights to shadows and retain more detail in the image and then kind of decide later what you want to do with it. I think that's kind of explains what it is. So far, I'd say the lighting conditions I've been testing this camera in could only be described as ideal. Cloudy with a chance of beautiful, soft, diffuse light. But I need to try this camera out in low light, and so later this evening I'm going to pop out again when it's pretty much pitch dark and see what we can do in the dark with this camera, because that's one of the main areas that it's going to be a big improvement from my Micro Four Thirds G85. Mostly I just want to go in right now because my hands are cold again. So it's later in the evening, and the bad news is it did not get any warmer after the sun went down. I have this light turned on, and this is just a typical light bulb situation. My first impression was I really wasn't blown away by like it making something out of nothing, creating a super bright image when there was no light at all. We're talking about low light, not no light, right? But the image it did capture was a usable picture. This was compared to my LUMIX G85, which I was used to, which is a very poor low light performing camera. At the top end of the ISO range, the image doesn't just get noisy, it like starts to break apart and the image quality really takes a hit. Just doesn't look good at all. So I would really avoid using the highest ISO at all costs. On the S5II, I tested it out to using the top end of the ISO, 51,200. And yes, the image is noisy, but it's not super oppressive, and I can even add a little bit of noise reduction in post, and we're left with an image that really looks pretty good and usable. This shot I did on the f3.5 kit lens at ISO 40,000, and then I bumped it up to ISO 51,200, and then later I got out the 50mm f1.8 prime and was able to get kind of the same exposure at ISO 12,000. I definitely would recommend having a nice fast lens like an f1.8 for shooting in low light. As you can see here, this is max ISO on the 50mm with just some ambient lighting from inside the house. It's filtering out the window. Like, to my comparatively inexperienced eye, I would have no problem using this in a film or any kind of project I was working on. I did test out shooting a fireside scene, and my main takeaway from this is that autofocus doesn't work the greatest in low light, which makes sense because, you know, autofocus has to have something to see to be able to know what to focus on. So I'll probably be using manual focus most of the time when shooting these campfire scenes. And also I didn't have my white balance dialed in quite right here, so the colors are a little weird, but I was able to successfully, you know, capture a campfire story, and I thought it turned out okay. After checking the website, I discovered that the RS3 Mini is actually not compatible with the Bluetooth control of the LUMIX S5II. But that's not a big deal because you can just use the USB-C cable to connect the camera to the gimbal. It just means you have another cable to be worried about, which isn't ideal, but it opens up all the functionality that the gimbal has. So you can start and stop recording, and you can configure the dial on the gimbal to do just about anything you want. You can adjust aperture, ISO, even manual focus. So no Bluetooth, but that's not really holding me back.
So I spent some quality time testing out the gimbal with the camera, and the gimbal is definitely a good tool to have. I don't think I'll be using it 100% of the time, but it definitely gets some great smooth shots. And it's a whole learning curve, just like all of this professional video stuff. Having autofocus while using the gimbal is very handy, but you know, again, I'm learning how the autofocus settings work, which settings work best, and sometimes it won't focus on what you want it to focus on right away. You have to kind of coax it along, so it's a lot to figure out, but it seems like 90% of the time it really does a pretty good job of capturing and getting in focus what should be in focus.
So when I began this video, I was complaining about how cold I was, all bundled up and freezing my fingers off, and today it's like 75, 80 degrees, and you might think that just means I take way too long to finish these videos, and you'd be right. But also the weather can change really quickly here in Oklahoma. I wanted to mention real quick something about the memory cards I'm using, because this was something new for me on this camera. It requires UHS 2 memory cards, and these are a little bit more expensive than your UHS 1 cards like I have on this camera. This isn't even the cheapest UHS 1 card you can get. It's kind of somewhat nice, a little more professional level, but it is still quite a bit cheaper than something like this, which is a Lexar UHS 2 V60 card. And if all these letters don't mean much to you, maybe I'll do a video in the future explaining what they all mean, because I'm kind of learning about them myself. But as you could probably figure out, the UHS 2 cards are a faster read and write speed than the UHS 1 cards, and that's important for things like the 6K open gate recording that this camera can do, because it's like a 200 megabits per second bit rate. And also, from what I understand, burst mode in taking pictures can actually be pretty taxing on the memory card as well. So if you're doing that, I guess a faster card is going to help with that as well. But being able to use these SD cards, even if they are a little bit higher level, is actually kind of an advantage on the price point compared to something like an A7S III from Sony, which I think requires the expensive CF Express cards that could be like, I don't know, 150 bucks each. I'm not really sure what the price is on those. So this is actually not too bad to spend, you know, 30 bucks a card or something like that to get some nice cards. And honestly, I'm not even being that concerned about the most expensive cards out there, because you can spend a lot of money even just on UHS 2 SD cards. Something I hadn't really considered too much, honestly, was the investment into the ecosystem that goes with your camera. Things like memory cards, batteries, chargers, filters, all that kind of stuff. And so over the last couple weeks, I've been going ahead and building out that kit. For memory, I just showed you I'm using those Lexar Professional 1667X cards. Not sure what all those numbers mean, but anyway, those are the ones I'm using. And for batteries, I decided to go with the aftermarket battery route, which of course is not recommended by anyone, but I have had good success in the past using some of these off-brand batteries. These are the Wasabi Power brand batteries from Amazon. They have pretty good reviews. Everybody seems to say they're some of the best knockoff batteries. I would love to use LUMIX batteries, but they're like 60 bucks each, and you can get 2 or 3 of these for the price of one OEM battery. So the route I'm going is using an official LUMIX charger and off-brand batteries. Maybe that'll help make sure the batteries maintain like stability between the cells and things like that. I don't know, I'll let you know how it goes. If these batteries turn out to be terrible, I'll make a video about it, hopefully. But the main reason I'm out here on this non-freezing cold day is to check out my new ND filter, because that was the main thing I was most excited about to really improve the functionality of shooting video on this camera. So I had an ND filter for my other camera. It was only 58 millimeters in diameter, and this new camera I have 2 lenses that are both 67 millimeters, so obviously I would need a new filter. And the one I decided to go with was this one from K&F Concept. It's the Nano X series. This particular filter is the ND2 to ND400 model, and the 67 millimeter diameter version was 80 bucks. And from what I understand, for a variable ND filter of that many stops, that's really pretty cheap. But from what I read online and from my personal experience, the K&F Concept filters are some of the best for the money, if you're not willing to invest like $300 in a filter right now, which I wasn't. That probably is somewhere in my future, but I'll give it some time. Mess around with this cheap one, see if it gets the job done, or if I really think it's worth investing in the, you know, Peter McKinnon Polar Pro or whatever that everybody talks about. I don't know, it's like 250 bucks. Anyhow, so let's grab this filter, throw it on here, and see how the footage looks. So it's spring here in Oklahoma, and I have a quick shot here of this blossom on this tree. And without an ND filter, I had to stop down to f9 to get a reasonable exposure. With the ND filter, I was able to keep it wide open at f3.5 on this lens. It is not the most intense sunny day, so this is not exactly a test of this filter, but more just an example of how I would use it. Something I learned yesterday is that these dogwood blossoms or whatever, they don't smell very good. So it's not super fun just hanging out here taking close-up videos of them. If you're not familiar with the concept, the reason I want to use an ND filter for video, or the reason you might want to, is because there is a proper shutter speed that you want to maintain while shooting video, and also it's nice to have a wide open aperture because it gives you that nice blurry background. Wide open aperture though lets in a lot of light, so if you don't want to change your aperture, you don't want to change your shutter speed, your ISO is already as low as it can go, you need another way to change your exposure, and that's where an ND filter comes in. Yeah, so there's not a lot more to be said at the moment about this filter. I intend to do in the future a dedicated video about the K&F Concept Nano X. You know, if it's worth it, if it's a decent filter for the money, and what my experience is with it after some time using it. Over the last couple weeks, I've been testing out this camera and building out kind of the bare bones kit to be able to do run and gun style video shoots with it. The significant things being extra batteries and an ND filter, which I now have. But so far, I've been really happy with my LUMIX S5II. There were some unexpected things I hadn't thought of really too much, like with a full frame camera, lenses are more expensive. Batteries are bigger, they're more expensive. Filters are a bigger diameter, they're more expensive. Like the whole ecosystem, like I was talking about, just comes with kind of its own accompanying cost, more than just the camera and the kit lens or whatever. At least setting it up the way I wanted to for shooting video. Stabilization is quite good. I'm not certain, but I think my LUMIX G85 may have a little bit better in-body stabilization. I haven't really compared them side by side too much, it's just kind of the feeling I have, only because it has the smaller micro four thirds sensor, which is easier to move around within the body with the sensor shift stabilization. Easier than a larger full frame sensor, which is close to double the size of a micro four thirds. But it's really good, and it can really hold its own and get you some very usable footage without a gimbal. One thing I saw while filming some slow motion footage, which I haven't done too much of yet, was a little bit of unexplained jitteriness in the footage. I couldn't really tell what that was about, but it seemed to only be when shooting at 120 frames per second. I think I was also in manual focus. I'll have to look into that and see what that's about. Definitely comment below if you've experienced that and have any ideas on what could be causing it. Oh yeah, and autofocus. Wow. Coming from a contrast-based, terrible autofocus, I basically had no experience using autofocus at all. So coming from that experience to this experience, I've been blown away by the performance of the autofocus, as you'd expect. I have no way to compare it to anything. I've been very happy with it though in general. It has its limitations. It doesn't think like you think always. It does do a good job of grabbing a focus somewhere, but not always on what you want it to focus on. So there's just kind of a whole learning curve with autofocus that I'm just getting into now. But it is definitely very serviceable, and it's been working pretty well for using when I have it on the gimbal and can't be adjusting focus manually all that well. So definitely learning all the settings and modes of autofocus has been kind of a journey. Right now I'm on the full area with human detection, so I have a box around my face here on the screen, and I think it's holding me pretty well. I haven't messed around too much with like the tracking modes or things like that. From what I've heard, the full area with the human detection on or off is the best autofocus mode for video, I think. But I have messed around with the zone autofocus that focuses just like in the middle, and then if you're out of the middle, then it will focus on whatever is inside that box. Coming from my crop sensor camera background, I definitely miss having the compact zoom. The kit lens that came with my LUMIX G85 micro four thirds camera was the full frame equivalent of a 24-to-120 zoom. Going from that to the 20-to-60 lens that I got with this camera, it's a transition. It's something to adjust to. I definitely find myself utilizing the upper extent of the zoom range on this 20-to-60, like the 50-to-60 millimeters, a lot. Not for vlogging, obviously. I like having the 20 millimeter for vlogging, but for any kind of shot where I'm setting up the camera and filming myself from a tripod, or for just my general purpose filming, I do. So I can definitely picture myself upgrading to a little bit more of a longer zoom range lens in the future. And shooting in vlog is something I'll be really excited to get into and explore. I haven't done too much of it just because I wanted to make sure I was getting usable footage as I was testing out my camera. But that'll be an area that I'll really start exploring to really take full advantage of what this camera can do. In most of the videos I've been shooting, I've been using the natural profile with a little bit of fiddling with the contrast and saturation settings. I think the footage has been looking pretty good, but comment down below what you think of what you've seen in this video. On the whole, I've been really thrilled to finally have a true professional level camera. And absolutely there are things in this camera that I don't know how to make use of because I'm not the most experienced filmmaker, but it has tons of room for me to grow with it. So far, I would not recommend this to someone as their first camera. You could get away with it, and if you didn't mind spending $2,000 on something you didn't know if you were into or not, then, you know, sure, give it a try. At this point, I was ready to step up from my entry-level camera into something I can really do professional work with. But the learning curve going from your phone to something like this, it's pretty steep. There's a lot to process about running manual settings, and even more on this camera than there is on an entry-level camera. So I would just recommend getting something on the entry-level side of things, probably a crop-censored camera, but something that has the ability to switch out lenses preferably if you want to get into more of the filmmaking, creative side of video making. So if you guys found value in this video, be sure to subscribe. And if it was fun, enjoyable, informational, any of those positive things, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Check out the link below if you want to buy this camera and support my channel through my affiliate link. My goal in this video was to do something different from what every other Lumix creator is doing and give you my honest perspective as, you know, to be honest, a beginner, somebody who hasn't used professional grade cameras before, and give you my first impressions from my unique perspective. So I hope that came across, and I'll see you guys next time.